Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sports Talk with Tonsoni. I'm your host, Brian Tonsoni. The college basketball season starts in a few weeks. Practice has been going on for some time, and everyone is excited to see their favorite team in action. This episode will be the first in a four-part series where Brian Morrow of Busting Brackets, myself, and a guest will preview every conference in the country. This episode will focus on the conferences from the eastern part of the country. Our guest tonight is Brian Ralph. Did I say that correctly?
You did.
Okay, of Busting Brackets as well. Brian is a graduate of South Carolina and currently resides in North Carolina, and we will together be covering these conferences: the American East, the Ivy Conference, the MAC, not the MAC in the Midwest, Northeast, the Patriot, the A10, the Big East, and the ACC on this show. So let's get started. Brian Morrow, I'm going to have to make sure I say the last names tonight because we have three Brians on the show. Brian Morrow, introduce yourself real quick.
Morrow, you guys have seen me on the podcast before. I write for Busting for about a year and a couple months now. Really excited for the college basketball season, and hopefully my picks for who's going to win the conference title do well. They probably won't, but that's my little disclaimer. So,
Brian Ralph, introduce yourself to our listeners.
My name is Brian Ralph, also write for Busting Brackets. Very excited. I've been covering college basketball for different outlets for about 7 years now or so. Very excited to get this season started. It's a season I think it'll be interesting. There's no clear-cut top teams. There's no clear-cut top players. There's a lot of parity, I think, at kind of every level of the sport, which will make for a very exciting season.
And speaking of that parity, we're going to start off into the American East, which produced its championship last year, UMBC, which was the first 16 seed to beat a number one seed in the NCAA tournament. And UMBC finished, I believe, third or fourth in the conference, finished second last year with a 25-11 overall record, 12-4 in the conference, behind Vermont, who only lost one conference game, but was defeated in the conference tournament. So, Brian Morrow, we'll start with you, and then you and Brian go back and forth until we're done with the American East, and then I'll chirp back in. But what should fans look for in this conference this season?
Not for UMBC to be a contender, I don't think. They lost a lot of pieces. I mean, what was that guy? I'm drawing a blank on what his name was at this point, but the
Jairus Lyles?
Yeah, Jairus Lyles. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes. Jairus Lyles, he was an interesting story in college basketball last year because he was really coveted by a lot of schools to be a grad transfer because of how good he was. He decided to stick with UMBC, and then he had probably the greatest game of his career, obviously the greatest game of his career, and the absolute whitewashing of Virginia last year in the tournament. So, I mean, I've watched Virginia basketball a lot. I am one of the proponents that has said sometimes that their style of play doesn't always work in the tournament against up-tempo teams, and UMBC was one of those, and it obviously needed to be a perfect storm for UMBC to win that. But this year, I think it's going to be more of the same, and I picked Vermont. However, I have Hartford as a 1B or 1A, technically. I think they're close.
Yeah, I think there are definitely a couple tiers in this conference. You have probably 3 or 4 teams who have no shot at really doing anything. You got a couple teams who have traditionally been good, and they're kind of programs who you wouldn't be surprised if you saw them compete at the top of the conference, like Albany, like UMBC. UMBC lost a lot. They lost a lot more than Lyles. They lost that tiny little point guard, JP Morrow, something like that, who was really, really good and key to what they did offensively. I think they'll still be good. I really like what Coach Odom has done with them in that regard. But like you said, it's clear to me Hartford and Vermont are kind of 1A, 1B. The difference for me going into the season right now, I have Hartford slightly ahead of Vermont because kind of like UMBC, Vermont lost a lot of people, a lot of key seniors from the teams they've had the last 2 years that have won 27, 29 games, pushed 30 and made them one of the best mid-majors in the country. They lost a lot of those guys. They have Anthony Lamb back, who I think will end up winning Conference Player of the Year. I think he's the best player in the conference But Hartford is coming off of a good year, returns pretty much everybody from that team, and I think you'll see them break through and win the conference this year.
Let me ask you guys this about these small conferences. That how hard is it for them to win the regular season and then win the tournament? I think everyone knows everyone, and they play so many conference games, and you see a lot of times the best teams like a Vermont don't get in. Any thoughts on that, and just on how difficult that is for a team to win both?
I think small conferences are madness, man. All of them. I mean, you can look at really any small conference tournament, and they're very rarely chalk. I mean, unless you go to like the Ohio Valley that year when Murray State was undefeated, or years like that. Even last year with Vermont being as dominant as they were in the tournament, they lost on a last-second, basically buzzer-beating prayer by Lyles, but they could never put UMBC away in that game last year.
I think it is tough, and I think the big reason behind that is the level of consistency you need to win not only the regular season title, but then translate that into a much different situation where you don't have as much time to game plan, so coaching plays less of a factor. If you have one guy who gets hot like Jairus Lyles did, who ended up being the best player of the conference, one of the best players really in the country for those couple of weeks in late February and early March, you get a guy that catches fire like that, and it can change everything. We've seen some of these small conferences try and change it up so they get their better teams and the regular season champs a better chance to go, and we've seen a couple conferences give just like their top two seeds double buys to where they essentially enter the tournament in the semifinals as a way to try and get them a bigger advantage as opposed to having to go through 3 straight days of games or things like that. So I think we're seeing these teams kind of adjust, but it's also one of the things that we love about the sport. It's just those last couple weeks of March and that unpredictability and who gets hot.
And speaking of conference tournaments, the last conference to adopt a conference tournament is the Ivy League, and they go to a 4-team tournament now. So let's transition on to the Ivy League. And Brian Morrow, start again. Who do you think people should look at in this league?
Much like the America East, that I think, as Brian pointed out, this is going to be another conference that has tiers in it. The bottom tier of this conference is not going to do anything really of any relevance at all. Then you have teams like Harvard and Penn, and I'll even throw Cornell in there, even though losing Stone Gettings is going to hurt them a lot. But they have teams like Harvard with Seth Towns and Bryce Aiken, and then Penn, who got the bid last year, are still going to be strong again. But Harvard seems to be, at least in my opinion, the team to beat going into the start of the season.
I agree. I think they clearly have the most talent in the conference. I don't think anybody else in the conference is capable of competing with another team that they may face in the first round of the NCAA tournament should they get the automatic bid. I think Harvard's the only team that can match up with a Power 5 team or a better Group of 5 team just from a talent, a size, and athleticism standpoint. And the guys you mentioned, Towns and Aiken, are two guys that are going to be a problem and one of the better backcourts of any major in the country. I would give them the edge. Yale is going to be a very good team as well. They have been for the past couple years now. Penn's always going to be tricky for me until they move the conference tournament, because as great as the Palestra is, and I think it's without Penn would be the perfect place for the Ivy League to have their tournament. But when you have Penn making it and then playing in their home arena, that gives them, I think, a major advantage and does a disservice to teams that finish higher like a Harvard or a Yale from a year ago.
Did Yale make the tournament a couple years ago?
Yeah.
Or are they on a long streak?
They made it a couple years ago. They had Mekhi Mason, who's now at Baylor, and they actually beat Baylor, I believe, in that first round game. Kind of shocked a lot of people. But since then, I don't know if they've been back since then. And if they did, I don't think they didn't do anything.
That was the game that had the famous quote by, if I'm not mistaken, I believe it was, his name escapes me again, but he said, you guys got out-rebounded by like 15. How is that possible? He goes, well, the ball went off the glass. and you put two hands up and you grab the ball, and Yale did that more times than we did. So that's how. So
Fair.
literally the greatest troll quote of all time.
I remember that now. And before that, Yale had not been in the tournament for a long period of time, and then they come in and they get that win.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one of those for anyone in the bracket. This is a conference where you look at, depending on the matchup, maybe they can win a game in the NCAA tournament and help you win your bracket down, which is 6 months away. Let's move on to the Metro Atlantic Athletic Conference.
Really
Go ahead, Brian.
Really quick on Harvard. One school in the Ivy League, and I'm sure say the same thing, that can consistently pull top 150 players, even though they're still Harvard and their admission standards. They are. I mean, Tom. He played at Duke. He won it, pretty sure, and he is able to go into places and pull kids that normally would go to other big schools and get like Towns and Aiken, for example.
He's the perfect fit for Harvard, and they're the I think only school in there. They're all Ivy League teams are always tough matchup because you know they're going to play smart and they're not going to beat themselves. But a lot of times the athleticism and overall skill set disadvantage plays a role in games not being as close maybe as you might expect them to be. But Harvard's the one team that not only has the Ivy League smarts and plays a efficient game, but they also have the size and athleticism and skill set to really compete with those upper tier teams.
Exactly.
So keep an eye on that conference and Harvard and those teams come tournament time for your upset special. And now we move on to the Metro Atlantic Athletic Conference, where 4 teams had winning records in the conference last year, and the team who finished 4th was the team who won the tournament. As we talked about already, the conference tournaments are what we love come March. Iona was the representative in the NCAA last year after Ryder and Canisius were both 15-3 in the tournament. Brian, Ralph, let's start with you on this conference. Which teams look to be the head of the conference, and is there any surprise team in a conference that seems to have maybe a 3, 4, or 5 seed come up and win occasionally? What are your thoughts on the Metro Atlantic Conference?
Yeah, I like to call this the MAC. Get those extra A's in there in the middle. To me, I think it's still you could get that occasional team that gets hot in March because, as we've seen in years past, there's no the top teams aren't overwhelming. I think though this year Ryder and Iona are going to be your top 2 teams that kind of trade back and forth. Ryder, as you said, went 15-3 in conference a year ago, and they returned pretty much everybody from last year's team, really. It's a good portion of their key players. Though that returning experience, along with how good they did in the regular season in conference play, plus maybe some added motivation of being upset in the conference tournament and wanting to represent their school in the NCAA tournament, that can be a driving factor for these teams who maybe feel like they need some redemption or maybe get to the NCAA tournament a year late. Even if they don't win the regular season title, I think that motivation could play a big role for them in March. So I would expect them I honestly would expect them to win both, but I definitely would expect Ryder to win the conference tournament.
Brian Morrow, your thoughts?
As well, Dimensino Vaughn, I think is how you say his name.
Mm-hmm.
Really good player.
Yes. Super
player that wow, that guy can ball. So and death taxes and Tim Cluess in March is one of the things that never Iona and never bet against Tim Cluess. A master, no matter where the season it seems, he's always in the conference tournament. A team that I am higher on than a lot of people are not. A team that I'm higher on and as I've seen getting a lot of helium lately, Quinnipiac. They have the making to just come out of nowhere and surprise everybody. I think Mount St. Mary's losing their coach is going to hurt.
Mm-hmm.
Siena, Jimmy Patsos did so much damage to them before he left. It's unbelievable. But I love that guy. It's a different conversation for it. I think Ryder and Iona and I do like Quinnipiac a lot because they have a good roster.
So there you have it for the Metro Atlantic Athletic Conference, the MAC with the extra A's. I'm going to have to remember that for the Mid-American around these parts of town. We're now going to move on to the Northeast Conference. And Brian Ralph, any team here that you think might be able to compete in that first round, or who do you think's the favorite?
I don't think there's anybody really that's going to be able to win a first round game. Traditionally, we've seen the conference champion end up as a 16 or 15 seed, which automatically puts them in a bad spot. That's going to be the case again this year. I think Fairleigh Dickinson and St. Francis are the two teams really to watch for me. Jamal King for St. Francis could be the difference in the conference. He averaged over 18 points per game last year. He's the conference's leading returning scorer. Outside of him, St. Francis doesn't have a whole lot. I like Fairleigh Dickinson over St. Francis in that regard, but King's the kind of guy who could go on a Jairus Lyles type run last year and get hot and carry them to a conference title and then potentially do some damage as a 16, 15, 14 seed if you want to. You can talk yourself into that if you want, but I still would go with Fairleigh Dickinson in the conference.
Ryan Morrow, go ahead and take.
So I have St. Francis. It's PA, the Red Flash. There's two St. Francis. St. Francis of Pennsylvania and St. Francis of New York. Or St. Francis Brooklyn. PA is the Jamal King as Brian, really good. They also have a player that Axton, who's a nice complement, who can also help pick up the scoring slack. Another team that I always like to keep an eye out on in the Northeast Conference, just because they've done it year in, year out, and they do it every year, and they did it last year, and it surprised me, was LIU Brooklyn.
Always.
I think they're well coached for that conference. Their coach is probably not going to be there long. They lost their best player in Joel Hernandez. Just probably have another guy step up and average 25 a game again, because that just seems to be what they do every year. So
that's fair.
What do you guys think about the ups and downs of these conferences? Do some of these teams stay at the top for long periods of time, or how long is the window, as is said in the sports, in some of these smaller conferences? And does the coaching make a difference? If you have an elite coach in a conference, are they more than likely to extend that winning window? Because these are the win the conference and usually the one and done in the NCAA tournament types. Your thoughts on those topics?
And for the Northeast, for example, they're one of those conferences like the SWAC. They just have a lot of money at all. They don't have great facilities. I mean, plays in a gym, and their gym above the rafters, the baseball team is up there that they push down when they're not playing. And the bleach, it's basically like a high school gym. I mean, it's pretty skin and bones. There's not a huge arena. I mean, they're just playing that have a gym in them. Not a lot of seats. It's hard to get people to go to their games. That's why a lot of these coaches, the Americans, they have more money. But for the Northeast Conference, for example, a lot of they want to get out because the resources available to them at the St. Francis and the LIU Brooklyns and the Wagners just isn't what it could be at really any other mid-major, any other conference really, other than the MEAC and the SWAC.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. It's a big problem for those conferences. Those are the ones that get hit hard by the grad transfers and players transferring up to try their hand at big-time college basketball. Coaching makes a difference only in terms of the conference tournament. Like if you have a coach who just knows how to prepare a team and get the most out of his team during those 3, 4, or 5 days, you're in a much better position than everybody else, because you could mess around during the regular season, get a 6 seed, maybe have some tough road trips. But if you can turn it on during that week and you have a coach who knows how to turn that on, suddenly you're the only team from the conference that's really getting any national recognition, and that's going to elevate your profile and give you a major advantage over everybody else. I think in the Northeast especially, we've seen the American East, I think, is another conference that this happens with, but there's no team that has necessarily staying power because you see those best players, those better players for the best teams move up divisions, but you have the same 2, 3, 4 teams kind of rotating between who's conference champion. Like you have an elite tier of teams that are able to kind of differentiate themselves from the lower tiers, and every now and again one of the lower tiers will pop up, but it's traditionally the same 2, 3, 4 teams who are able to kind of rotate in and get all of the conference championships.
This is good stuff. This is Sports Talk with Tonsoni. We're talking with a couple of Brians, actually 3 of us, about some college basketball preview, especially the Eastern, the conferences in the eastern part of the country. We've been through 4 conferences. We have 4 more conferences to go. We are now moving on to the Patriot League, and this league has had some success over the years in the tournament, specifically with Bucknell program, who has been able to win the tournament, get into the NCAA, and has defeated some bigger schools in the past. Brian Morrow, let's start with you on this one. What teams are there that are going to be at the top of the Patriot Conference?
I have attested to that this is wide open conference in the entire country next year. There's not one team that just glares at you that could be a possibility of better than the next. The team that I have picked to win it is Colgate. They have turning from last year, but that's not saying much because last year Bucknell was so much better than everyone else. But both of Bucknell's stars, is that his name? Zach? What is his name? Nana Fallon is one. I don't remember what the other.
Oh, I know who you're talking about, but yeah.
Yeah, big tall guy. Yeah.
Yeah.
They're both gone, and those guys were the 2 best players in the conference last year, and Colgate has a lot of guys returning. Now, a team to keep an eye on who has, as we talk, majors and the lower ones have, revolving door of like 4 or 5 teams. One team that has stepped up to win the conference a lot and the essentially down is Lehigh. And again, CJ McCollum, who went to Lehigh, is in the NBA. They have who's also probably going. So that's just when you have an NBA player in a mid-major conference, it helps you win a lot of games.
Last year in the Patriot League, I'm counting 1, 2, 3, 5 teams with winning records in the regular season conference of the 10 teams in the league. So that speaks to what Brian just said about it's a wide open conference. Brian, Ralph, your thoughts on the Patriot League?
I still think you got to keep an eye on Bucknell because that difference between them and the rest of the conference last year was so great. And they're one of these mid-major programs that may take a slight step back, but they're always there. You wouldn't be surprised if they won either the regular season or the conference tournament. I agree Lehigh's a team to keep an eye out for. I think Boston University is another team that could potentially sneak through. Again, this is a wide open conference, so really anybody in the top half has enough talent to win. It's just a matter of who can play consistently, defend their home court, and then put together those 3-4 straight days of quality basketball in March. I think Lehigh will eventually win the conference tournament. I think this will be the year they kind of get back into that. It's going to cause a lot of problems in brackets because a lot of people who don't pay attention will see Lehigh and think, oh, they beat Duke that one time. All right, then, man. They're a good team.
Yeah. Colin and Duke was not playing very well. So,
but they'll remember CJ, like you said, they'll remember CJ McCollum. They'll remember because it's Duke. They'll definitely remember that one, and so Lehigh will pop up on their bracket, and they'll say, "Oh, Lehigh, I need to write Lehigh in." And Lehigh's a quality team, but I don't think they're gonna really give any Power 5 team or anybody that they'll play in the first round a major threat.
Do you guys think?
Can I say? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Something too about kind of the mid majors. So as Brian Ralph had talked about with even the Northeast Conference about how they're all going to be like a 15 or 16. The fact that all of these teams have to go and play huge Power 5, Power 6 schools because they have no money is going to rack them up enough losses to where their records are going to look terrible,
right,
regardless of how good of team they actually are. So they're destined for the 15-16 seed line. It's just going to happen. I mean, last year, there was no way, and I still attest to this, there was no way that UMBC was a 16 seed, much less the worst team in the tournament last year, based upon seed line. But that's where they were, and Virginia also realized that they were not that bad. So that's just my little 2 cents on that. But
what do you think when it does come time to pick your brackets? Yeah, here's a conference. Lehigh has beat Duke, and Bucknell has beat some Power 5 schools. Are there certain conferences to look at that have a better chance? Are there certain conferences that get better athletes and maybe hit on a pro athlete every once in a while? Or is it just, some team in a small conference has that magic at the right time? Is there any kind of pattern that our listeners can kind of look for through the season? Or is it just a random occurrence on the right day in March?
I think there are conferences that you look at first for those upsets, but you have to look at each team individually. Like the Patriot League has had history of those kind of things, but when Lehigh made the tournament in 2012, like Lehigh hadn't done anything. Lehigh wasn't anything special, but if you looked at who they were and they had CJ McCollum, you look at that team, you're like, oh, this team could do something. But the following year, Patriot League, and anybody who comes out of the Patriot League isn't going to pull off an upset like that. You have to look at the specific team. The conferences may be able to tell you who traditionally has teams that are on a athletic skill level to be able to compete with some of those bigger teams. So you need to look at those first, but I wouldn't pick a team just based on the conference they came from. You have to look at each team specifically.
I would say that because, I can tell you with almost 100% certainty that same year that Lehigh beat Duke, nobody had Norfolk State beating Missouri. No. And the one year that Hampton beat the Marcus Fizer-led Iowa State team, nobody had that. And that Hampton team had nobody of note on it. However, the Norfolk State team did have Kyle O'Quinn, who is a journeyman in the NBA, but he still plays. But nobody had those upsets, just like nobody. And the year that Duke has actually taken some decent ones in the tournament over the last maybe decade. I mean,
except for Mercer.
They got beat by Mercer and Lehigh in back-to-back seasons. So K's taken a few, but he's also won his fair share too. So
one thing too with upsets, because you'll get those where the team just comes out of nowhere. A lot of times when that team comes out of nowhere, for instance with Missouri, Frank Haith, who was the coach at the time, is notoriously terrible in the NCAA. On the flip side of that, when you're looking for upsets, look at coaches and teams who are historically bad or underachieve in March. Like for a stretch, Kansas maybe doesn't always go as far as they should. Coaches like
Villanova for a while
until they won, and the past 5 years they've won 2 titles and advanced out in the second round 3 times.
Yeah,
so, it's hit or miss with them. But look for those teams as well when you're looking for upsets. The teams and programs that traditionally may not have as much success as you would expect them to in the NCAA tournament.
Another thing I like to do is just, of course, this is me being the basketball writer guru that I am, looking at teams like, for example, Loyola Chicago last year, or when Lehigh made their run, or then you have the team like Murray State, or even that St. Joseph's team. And there's one more that I'm trying to think of. Well, even when Gonzaga first got in the tournament, I mean, they're not really a mid-major anymore, but those are the kind of, or Buffalo last year. That Buffalo team last year was grossly underseeded.
Yes.
Grossly underseeded. That team should have been a top 5 seed in the tournament. They were ridiculously good. They got dudes everywhere, and they drew Arizona and just ran Arizona out of the gym. So
another thing, the last thing I'll say about this is pay attention to who wins these kind of games in the non-conference schedule. In late November, early mid-December, Loyola Chicago, for instance, last year went on the road, beat Florida in Gainesville. Everyone kind of realized, these guys might be kind of good. They showed they can beat these teams, and then held strong all season long. A couple years ago, Hawaii went out and they beat somebody who was really good. I think they actually won like a Christmas tournament. And they beat a couple good teams, and then got to the NCAA tournament and upset Cal in the first round. Like those
that
teams.
That was the year the Hawaii team. That was the year that Nebraska was preseason ranked.
Yes,
because that was the year they just came out of the tournament and they blasted Nebraska in that first game of the tournament. Of course, realizing as I'm a Nebraska fan that Nebraska team wasn't very good, but at that point in time, that Nebraska team was undefeated. So, and Hawaii crushed them.
So pay attention to those teams that make statement wins in the non-conference, and then if you see them pop up in your bracket again later on, remember, like, kind of keep a mental stock of those teams and kind of see who they're playing.
This is really good stuff now for our listeners to pay attention to these smaller one-bid conferences and the results in the non-conference season as well as the conference season. And everyone always turns into tournament week to watch those tournaments. But this is really interesting conversation here. But now we move from the one bid to what we call multiple bids in the bracketology. These are conferences that can get not only their conference tournament winner or their designated winner into the tournament, but might be able to get multiple teams. And we're going to start with the A10. And last year they were able to get 3 schools into the NCAA. They've had upwards of 4 or 5 at times. So who are the favorites, gentlemen, and how many bids do you think this conference might be able to garner this year? We'll start with you, Brian Morrow, on the A10.
So this conference is another weird one because there's not really a clear-cut team. I mean, last year it was Rhode Island. Everyone kind of knew that going in.
Yeah.
This year, I have a hard time betting against Bob McKillop ever, so I'm going to go with Davidson. St. Louis has the best roster, but their coach is a problem, in my opinion, at least. And then you just got to look at teams like George Mason, who have a really good core. Teams like UMass have a really good core and a really good young coach, but I don't know if UMass is really there yet. And you still have to kind of put Rhode Island in there because Hurley built them. So I don't know if they'll be too bad. And St. Bonaventure, because even though they did lose probably the best backcourt in college basketball, they still have some pretty good pieces.
This is a conference. I'll go to you, Brian, in just a second. This is a conference that has had some teams that have made really significant runs in the tournament over the years. You go back to Davidson when they had a player. George Mason makes it to the Final Four. VCU to the Final Four. St. Joseph's as well. So depending on who's playing, there's some decent coaches in this conferences. This is a conference to watch when they're at their best. Can really make some noise come NCAA tournament time. Brian Rolfe, take it away.
I think St. Louis, Davidson, and George Mason are probably the 3 teams that will get in the tournament from here. If they get 3 bids, it wouldn't surprise me if they got 2. And maybe it was just two of those 3 teams. It wouldn't surprise me if they got 4, and either UMass or Rhode Island slipped in there as well. But I think those 3, St. Louis, Davidson, George Mason, are kind of that top tier of teams who will be competing for the regular season title. St. Louis, to me, has by far the best roster. Coaching is a problem.
Yes.
Offense might be a problem, but they have legit size everywhere. They have athleticism everywhere. The problem for them is going to be coaching in close games, and then if they can score enough. They were one of the worst offensive teams in the country last year. How are they going to improve on that? They'll be deeper this year, which may help them, but I'm not sure if they have enough to necessarily get over the hump. The roster says they do. I'm a little skeptical, but also very high on them. I think we could see them have a really big year. Davidson has the best coach in the conference, I think, Bob McKillop. They have the best player in Kellen Grady, who's a point guard that NBA teams are watching. So you can't count them out. I'm going to give the edge to St. Louis here. I think St. Louis has the potential, too, if they get in the tournament, to win a couple games because of their defense and their size. They can match up with a Power 5 team, so I like them in that regard. Coaching has me a little skeptical. I like them a lot. I'm trying to temper my expectations because I really like the roster. We'll just have to see.
And is there one team that does not look like to be in the top 3 or 4 that could come up and surprise in the A10?
UMass. They have one of the best players in the country. Luwani Pipkins gets buckets, man. That dude can fill it up. Like, I mean, that dude he's fun to watch. He's their point guard. He's really good.
UMass has been building towards this for a couple of years too. Like this is the year that they're supposed to be taking the next step and kind of be in contention for a tournament bid. So that certainly wouldn't be a surprise. I mean, it would be a surprise, but it also wouldn't be a surprise if they made kind of took that extra step when they made this leap to make the NCAA tournament. People are counting Rhode Island out, but again, as we've mentioned, they have a very good roster still. Danny Hurley left a lot of good pieces in place and a good program, so it wouldn't surprise me if they didn't have the drop-off that we expect.
Fats Russell on there.
Fats Russell.
Really good player.
There you go.
Yeah.
So look for a couple teams from the A10 to make the tournament, and now we're into some power conferences from the East. We're going to start with the Big East, and one of the questions I'd like to ask both of you overall is the Big East going to take a step back, some heavy graduations, or does it just reorganize itself to being the top conference or one of the top conferences that it's been, as well as the normal who's gonna be the favorite? So, Brian Rolfe, let's start with you. Is the Big East still going to move forward, or is it going to possibly take a step back? And then who is your favorite?
It's going to take a step back. I think in terms of just overall depth at the top. Villanova is not going to be Villanova we've seen the last couple of years. They're going to be a very good team, a top 20 team, but they're not going to make a run to the Final Four. I don't think they're too young. They don't have enough depth at the moment. They're going to be good. They're going to win the conference because there's nobody who can really challenge them at the top, I don't think, who has their overall talent and skill and the culture that Jay Wright has. They're going to play the right way. They're going to be good. They're going to win the conference again. 2 through 9, though, in the conference, you could make the case for any of those teams finishing 2. You can make the case for any of those teams finishing 9. And as many as 4 or 5 of those teams could make the NCAA tournament. It's kind of just a crapshoot right now. The team I'm really interested to see, though, a lot of people are very high on Marquette in the preseason. A lot of people think they may finish second. I am really high on St. John's. I'm a believer in St. John's. I love Shamori Pons, excuse me. Mustafa Heron, getting him eligible, I think, is a big deal for them, getting Pons as running mate. You got a big man transfer in from Auburn who's going to give them some toughness down low. I think Chris Mullen is a better coach than a lot of people give him credit for. I don't think people realized how bare the cupboard was when he first got in charge of the program. Results could be better. They haven't had a winning season yet under him. But I don't think he's gotten the – people have been harder on him than I think they should be. But this is the year where they need to take that step forward, and I think they will. I think they'll finish second in the conference.
Brian Morrow, your thoughts?
I do. I think it'll be a down year, but down year for Villanova, so they make the Final Four instead of win a title. So, or go out in the Sweet 16. They are going to have a much different looking roster, but as Brian Rolfe said, they'll it's a Jay Wright coach team still. They're going to play like they're supposed to. They're not going to do anything flashy because Villanova teams never do anything flashy. They just beat you into submission and usually run up the score on you late because it's what they do. However, I also am one that really likes St. John's as well. I do have Marquette at second in the conference just because I think that having the player of the year in the Big East is going to do a lot for Marcus Howard.
That'll help.
If you have not watched Marcus Howard yet, the kid can shoot the lights out and he never misses a free throw. I mean, that's basically like the 10-second scouting report on Marcus Howard. St. John's I do like. I tell you, I watched them play a lot last year, and I could not figure out how they had that long losing streak in the middle of the season because that team had a lot of talent last year. I mean, they beat Duke. They went to a neutral court in the middle of a 12-game losing streak and beat Duke. So it's there. They can do it. One thing is for sure in the Big East, and it's always going to be true, DePaul is going to finish in last. So
I do think Georgetown's a team that's been down there. It would not surprise me this year if Georgetown was in contention for an NCAA tournament bid. I think they'll end up in the NIT, which would be a major step forward for them, but I would not be surprised if they were kind of sniffing around the bubble in February.
That took one of my questions I was going to ask about. Ewing led Georgetown, saw them play at Xavier last year in person, and they weren't necessarily too far off. They weren't great, but it looks like maybe they're headed in an upward trend. And if I could ask you about a couple teams in the Midwest that belong to the Big East, how's Xavier going to transition with their new coach, Travis Steele, is one question. And then outlook for Butler this year, which is here in the state of Indiana, and a lot of listeners may either follow Butler or at least follow them as a secondary team to some of the others. Your thoughts on Xavier and Butler? Whoever wants to jump in can take the first one.
I'll go with Xavier. I'm not as high on Xavier as some others are. Initially, I was, but breaking down the roster, I mean, they're still going to have Chris Mack's guys, and Travis Steele is doing a heck of a job of recruiting. But losing what they lost is really hard to replace. And last year was one of those magical seasons for Xavier that you don't really just kind of come into, I don't think. So I don't think that they'll be terrible. I think I still think they're going to make the tournament, but I don't think they're going to be, at the top 2-3 seed anymore again.
Yeah, I agree. I think they're still going to be good. I think they'll finish top half of the Big East, which will make them somewhat of a bubble team. But on the right side, I think that they may grab like a 10 seed or so, feels about right. Maybe getting that 8-9 game. They have some good pieces. I think Paul Scruggs is going to be a very,
Not
very.
Jay Marshall is still there, I think, isn't he?
They seem to have just some interchangeable pieces that I think the transition from Chris Mack to Travis Steele, they're still going to play the same way. They still have that style. They're not going to go through a changeover year where they have to worry about kind of some turnover and learning a new system. Everything's going to be the same. The only difference is losing a guy like Trayvon Blewett, losing a guy like JP McCura, guys who meant so much to them on both ends, particularly offensively. Replacing Blewett's scoring is going to be this team's biggest problem, and is going to keep them from being that sort of upper echelon team in the conference.
Thoughts on Butler?
They are one of the most consistent programs in the country. I don't see that changing. They've gone through 5 coaches in the last 10 years or so, and every single year they find themselves in the exact same spot. Butler is the one team, a lot like Villanova, and I'll even throw Creighton in there, even though being a Nebraska fan, it still kind of hurts me to say that a little bit, but I'll throw Creighton in there too. They're the one school. Those are the 3 schools really that don't recruit based upon stars. They recruit because of what type of player they are. Butler recruits players. They can get the top players, but they recruit players that fit into what they're trying to do, which is how they've remained so consistent over the years, like year after year after year. And Brad Stevens built it up, but he's gone, obviously, and doing a heck of a job in the NBA. So he's obviously not coming back, but they still remain just so unbelievably consistent year in, year out.
Butler's always one of the toughest teams for me for that reason. Because if you just look at their roster and on paper, they don't necessarily have the talent of a team that you're like, that's a lock for the NCAA tournament. But because of the consistency they play with, the style of play, they know who they are and they play to their strengths and they defend their home court, which is one of the keys to getting those big wins. They also play Villanova really well. They've beaten Villanova each of the past 2 years, which has helped their resume. But they defend their home court well. They play to their style and play it well. They have a lot of guys who don't get sped up, so they're not a team that's going to go crazy and turn the ball over 30 times a game if a team's pressing them or someone's having an off game. Everybody kind of contributes. Talent-wise, I don't know if they're an NCAA tournament team, but I'll have a hard time actually saying the words that Butler isn't going to make the NCAA tournament, because I think they will somehow find their way in there.
And the Big East will get multiple bids in, and it just depends on who's at the top of the conference and exactly how many bids, depending on what's going on across the country. We have about 10 minutes left, gentlemen, to discuss probably and arguably one of the best, if not the best, conferences in all of college basketball, the ACC. Talk about how many bids you think the ACC will get along with the favorites at this time. Brian Ralph, let's start with you. Number of bids and who's likely to be the top team or top teams?
I think we'll go 8 bids. in the ACC. I think 8's a good number. I think Louisville finds their way in the first year under Chris Mack. I think he's a good enough coach, and they have enough depth with the grad transfers they brought in to squeak in one of the bottom seeds. They don't have that top end guy or top end guys who are going to be stars, but they have 10 guys who are all capable of contributing. So I think that'll get them a spot. I think NC State is another team that's going to get one of those kind of smaller bids. We see them as a 10 seed, 8, 9 seed like they were last year. They're going to be good enough with the fast-paced, pressing style of play that Kevin Keats likes to play, their head coach, to pull off some upsets like they did last year. Remember last year, they beat UNC. They beat Arizona. They beat these really, really good teams. We'll see them beat some teams like that again. But last year, they also lost to UNC Greensboro. They lost to Georgia Tech. They had some just really head-scratching losses. We'll see. I think we'll see that kind of inconsistency again, but those big wins will get them in. And in terms of top teams, I think it's a 3-horse race between Duke, UNC, and Virginia. I'm on record. I think North Carolina is the best team in the country this year. The only major hole that they have is at point guard, and I think the combination of Kobe White and Seventh Woods, but particularly Kobe White, who's 5-star freshman they have coming in, is going to erase all doubt about that within 5 games. But the way Virginia plays in the regular season and the way Duke defends their home court, I think it'll be Duke or Virginia that wins the regular season title in the ACC, but UNC will win the conference tournament, and then I think UNC will win the national championship.
Before I go to Brian Morrow, from a coach's perspective, I think that I really like what you just said there, Brian, because sometimes it's talent in a multiple day tournament where you have to win 3 games in a row. But there's a difference between how you play in the regular season with time to prepare and travel and all of that and style, and then what style plays best in the ACC tournament. And sometimes it's your best athletes or a hot team at that point. And that's that. I think that goes in the NCAA too. Your better talent sometimes rises in those situations. Better coaching or better systems might be able to eke out some more wins in preparation. And I think that is in play here with Virginia and Duke and North Carolina, those different styles in this conference. Brian Morrow, number of bids for the ACC and who you think are your favorites.
Okay, well, I'll stick with 8. 8's a good number. It's really hard to get in 9. It's really hard to get in 10. 8's a good number. I am gonna. My whole thing with the ACC is I can't wait to watch this because literally, as Brian Ralph knows, the 3 freshmen that play at Duke are unbelievable players, and so let's just say this. There's always a fan out there who loves to see kids who have rim-shaking, earth-shattering dunks who's a freak of nature. That's Zion Williamson. Then you have the greatest, probably one of the best high school players that I've ever seen in my life, in R.J. Barrett, who's from Canada. And then you have another kid who would be the number 1 kid in the country, if not for R.J. Barrett and Cam Reddish playing there as well. Then they have another guy who's unheralded, but was also a top 15 recruit in Joey Baker, who's going to come in and give them quick points when they need it. And that's only on Duke. And then North Carolina has Nas Little, who I've seen some NBA scouts saying that they've watched the kid play and think that he's going to be number 1 in the lottery this year without even playing a college game. And that's over Barrett and Zion and Cam Reddish. And then you also have Virginia, who with their style of play, but they still have one of the best players in the country in DeAndre Hunter. So those 3 schools are going to probably be at the top. I am a lot higher on Boston College than probably anybody.
I was about to bring that up.
They're right there. I think this could be the year finally for Jim Christian that he gets them there. Team, they really came into their own last year. Obviously Boston College was one of the worst Power 5 programs for probably the last 5-10 years. And last year they won some really big games, and they again are another team that beat Duke last year as well. Seems to be a theme with teams in this podcast of teams that beat Duke. It's just because if you want to be number 1, you got to beat number 1. But I have also gone on record saying that I don't think that it's really that much of a race, and I think Duke is going to just run away with the title. So,
if a ninth team is going to get in, I think it will be Boston College because Kai Bowman, their point guard, is special and can do everything. If he averages 27 and 7, it's not going to be a surprise.
Kid is a triple double waiting to happen.
Literally.
Yeah, I'm not joking. Like he will get. Kai Bowman will get, and you guys can kill me on Twitter for this later, but he's going to get at least 3 triple doubles this year, and I don't think he'll do it. It won't be that hard for him to do it either.
I wouldn't bet against it. I will say there are 3 things in the ACC, not to take up too much time, that I'm really interested to see. The first one with regards to Virginia, we've kind of just assumed now that they're going to be at the top of the conference, and I think they will be. But one thing that'll be interesting for me to watch how other teams attack them. When UMBC beat them last year, Coach Odom went to the podium and talked about how they pressed Virginia and pressed Ty Jerome and pressed Kyle Guy, and that's what they had success with, getting them kind of out of the rhythm offensively. And they hadn't really seen anybody do that. They had kind of been able to walk the ball up the court as they wanted to and get into their set. They hadn't been pressed. UMBC pressed them, and Virginia really struggled with that. I'm curious to see how other teams approach Virginia now, and if other teams try and maybe pick up a half court, pick up 3/4 court, and apply more pressure. I want to see how Ty Jerome and Kyle Guy handle that.
It is weird you say that, but I often think a lot of times the way teams attack Virginia is just because they expend so much energy on offense, even trying to get a look at the basket half the time.
That's true.
By the time they're on defense, they're just done. I mean, they have no energy left. Which is why it was so impressive what UMBC did, because they took quick shots, they hoisted a lot of threes, and they made a lot of them. And then when they weren't making threes, they were just backdoor cutting them to death. And obviously it led to a absolute pasting in the NCAA tournament. So
they pressed, they got the turnovers, and then they would go down and score in 5 seconds, and they'd focus again on defense. I think that's going to be something to watch against Virginia this year. And then going back to the freshmen, specifically for Duke, I think R.J. Barrett's going to win National Player of the Year this year. He doesn't get talked about in the same breath as guys like Ben Simmons and the guys who went into their freshman year as these super heralded blue chip prospects who NBA teams are drilling over. R.J. Barrett isn't the same player as Ben Simmons, obviously, but he's just as good coming into college, if not better, than I think any of them have been in recent years. I think he'll win National Player of the Year this year. I also think Zion, people have given him a lot of crap, unnecessarily, because they see him dunking all these highlights and wonder, well, can he shoot? Can he do anything but dunk? Yes,
he can. I'll tell you, yes, he can.
Him as a small ball 4 with his quickness and freakish athleticism is going to be a problem for teams. If he's in the post, he's going to out-jump the guy and out-strength the guy because he's 275 freaking pounds and dunk on someone's head. And if your 4-man tries to guard him out in the perimeter, he'll blow right by you in 2 steps.
Now, I don't mean like, and I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, you're fine.
I just want to gush about Zion for a second. I don't mean to say like, I mean, the kid, and I will admit, I first found out about him about 3 years ago watching some highlight videos.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm that guy. But then I watched more on him, and the highlight videos don't really show the type of basketball player the kid is. He's a freak. I mean, I use this term like he literally is a freak. They're kids that are as big as he is. He's like LeBron of college basketball. Well, let's not go that far. I mean, he's not as talented as LeBron, but like he, as Brian Ralph said, you're going to take him off, be like, oh, well, there's a 6'5" kid playing the 4 and I'm 7 foot tall. So I'm just going to play lackadaisical defense. And then he's going to jump over you and dunk on you.
Yeah.
And I'm not like, and he'll do it flat footed. The kid's never lost a dunk contest in his life. I don't see it happening ever at any point in his life. I mean, he is a monster, and he's so much fun to watch.
I think, too, the last thing I'll say, I've said UNC, I think UNC is going to win the national championship this year. I think we'll see both Duke and UNC in the Final Four, which has only happened one other time in 1991. I think we'll see both of them get in. The ACC will get 2 teams in the Final Four.
Nas Little's a beast too. The kid from UNC.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Absolute freak.
Real quick here, we're at about the 5-minute mark before we have to sign off. But Notre Dame, a local school here in Indiana, they seem to be down. A lot of people picking them in the latter half of the season. A quick outlook on Notre Dame.
There's just not enough there. I think we saw that last year when Bonzi Colson went down and Matt Farrell was dealing with injuries. There's not a lot there right now. Next year, when they add some more talent and their young guys kind of progress and become another year older, they can get back in the NCAA tournament mix, I think. But during this stretch they've had where they've been incredible and made the NCAA tournament every year, they've had 2 or 3 guys who you can rely on and say, these 2 guys are some of the best players in the ACC. They can go win us a game. Everybody else can play good complementary basketball to those guys, and those guys will carry us. They don't have those guys anymore. They can develop them, but they don't have those guys right now, and that's the difference.
Brian Morrow, anything on Notre Dame?
Yeah, I'll just play devil's advocate here and say never bet against Mike Bray. I mean, the guy seems to every year take
That's
nothing
true.
and create something out of it. So him and Jay Wright, him and Tim Cluess and Jay Wright are the 3 guys that and Mark Few. It's really hard to say like, yeah, they're not going to make it just looking at their roster because every single year they beat somebody. And the way Notre Dame plays, they're going to knock somebody off. They're going to win enough good games, and they're going to beat enough good teams to where they're going to get the benefit of the doubt just like they did last year, even though I'm still taking this to my grave, and I'll die on the hill. Notre Dame had 0 business being in the tournament last year, and they did not. Yeah, like they shouldn't have even been in consideration for being in the NCAA tournament last year. They had horrible losses. But
I don't think the resume, the whole thing with Bonzi Colson without Bonzi Colson, the resume with Bonzi Colson, I don't think was good enough.
I don't either. They lost to Ball State with him. I'm sorry. I'm not.
Yep. And Indiana.
Yeah, and Indiana, and their best win was over Wichita State and Maui, which looked great at the time, and as the season went on, was an okay win, but not one that moves the needle.
But Wichita State didn't have Shamet at that time either, so it's just whatever.
True.
Hate to cut this off. I can go on for another hour. I really appreciate getting to meet you, Brian Ruff, through Brian Morrow. Brian, thank you for this suggestion. We'll be doing this every Monday for the next 3 weeks or so to get all the conferences out. We're down to about 2 minutes. Quickly, Brian Ruff, share with our listeners where they can find your work and connect with you on social media.
BustingBrackets.com is the best place you see my stuff. You see Brian Morrow's stuff. You see a lot of great writers. We have called every conference, every team covered from pretty much every angle on there with a great team of writers. If you want to see my stuff specifically, you can go to bustingbrackets.com. I think /author /BRalph. I'm not mistaken, BRAUF. You can find me on Twitter at BRalph33, BRAUF33. All my stuff will be there. Be writing a lot about the year. I think I have Pac-12 and American power rankings this year, along with I'll be keeping a close eye on the National Player of the Year race and just everything else that's going on in the country. So if you'd like, you can find all my work in those places.
That's awesome. Brian Morrow, share with our listeners where they can find your work.
Again, as Brian Rouse said, you can find me at bustingbrackets.com. I have a lot of stuff on there, so I do a lot of mid-major basketball as well as a lot of I do the ACC and the Big Ten, as I'm a Nebraska fan, so I will do. What's that?
I'm sorry.
Hey, you know what? Maybe this could be my year. Probably won't, but it could be. I'm optimistic, so we'll see what happens. So you can find me there. You can also find me on Twitter at 3ColorBeard, as my beard is 3 colors, and that's all I have. So thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your time. That'll do it for this edition of Sports Talk with Tonsoni. Follow us on Twitter at SportsTons and at Delphi Brackets for the bracket information. We're about ready to put out our preseason bracket in the next week or two. Sports Talk with Tonsoni.com for our high school students and our faculty doing some written work on the side. Contact me at Twitter at Sony42. So for Brian Ruff, Brian Morrow, I am Brian Tonsoni signing off. Good evening.